April 28, 1945. On that day, the Italian dictator met a physical end so brutal it remains a historical scar. Benito Mussolini did not die as a statesman, he died as a fugitive, executed and hung by his heels in a Milan square. July 29, 1883. Mussolini was born in Predoppio, a small town in northern Italy. The setting was humble. His father, Alessandro Mussolini, worked as a blacksmith. He was a militant socialist who studied the works of Karl Marx. His mother, Rosa Maltoni, taught at the local school. She was religious, quiet, and disciplined. The boy grew up between these two extremes. One side was radical politics. The other side was strict Catholic education. Even his name was a political statement. His father named him Benito after Benito Juarez, the Mexican revolutionary. The choice was deliberate. Mussolini was not a peaceful child. He was rebellious and prone to sudden outbursts. He sought out fights and gained a reputation for aggression. But there was another side to him. He was intelligent. He excelled at writing. He practiced public speaking until his voice could command a room. At age 10, his parents sent him to a strict Catholic boarding school. It did not change him. He attacked an older student with a penknife. The school expelled him immediately. This pattern repeated. At his next school, he stabbed another student in the hand. The violent streak was already a permanent part of his character. In his early 20s, Mussolini shifted toward journalism. He embraced his father's socialism. He wrote articles for radical newspapers. He demanded rights for the working class. He spoke at rallies. People began to listen. 1909. Mussolini moved to Trento, a city then under the control of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He took over as editor of a socialist paper called L'Avvenire del Lavoratore. Translated, The Future of the Worker. His writing was sharp and dangerous. The authorities watched him. They didn't wait long. Within months, police moved in and arrested him. But this was only the beginning. 1912. This was the year Benito Mussolini rose to the top of the Italian Socialist Party. He was a weapon of words and a master of the microphone. He didn't just speak, he demanded strikes, organized protests, and shut down factories. At this stage, he hated war. When World War I began in 1914, he stood firm on the side of neutrality. He followed the party line. Why did a pacifist become a warmonger? The answer lies in ambition. He realized that peace was static, but war was a catalyst. Mussolini changed his mind. He began to argue that conflict would expand Italian borders and consolidate power. This was a total betrayal of socialist doctrine. The party reacted immediately. In late 1914, they stripped him of his membership and kicked him out. Mussolini was now a man without a party. He shifted his identity from socialist to nationalist. To spread his new message, he launched his own newspaper titled Il Popolo d'Italia. He used the pages to scream for militarism and extreme patriotism. In 1915, his wish was granted. Italy entered the war alongside Britain and France. Mussolini did not stay behind a desk. He joined the army and moved to the front lines. The footage from this era shows a man in uniform projecting strength. But the war nearly ended him. In 1917, a mortar shell exploded in his trench. Shrapnel tore into his body. The doctors counted 40 wounds. He was discharged and sent home a veteran. The year was 1918. The war ended, but the peace was a disaster. Italy was a landscape of ruins and rage. Soldiers returned to find empty pockets and breadlines. Inflation destroyed savings. Jobs did not exist. The government in Rome was paralyzed. Political factions fought in the streets with knives and clubs. Mussolini watched the chaos. He saw a vacuum. In 1919, he gathered a group of disillusioned veterans and founded the Fasci di Combattimento. This was the birth of fascism. He combined three elements: nationalism, militarism, and absolute authority. He made a single promise: he would restore the glory of the Roman Empire and crush the communists. He created a private army to enforce his will. They were the Blackshirts. These were not soldiers, but violent thugs in uniform. They carried out raids on socialist headquarters. They burned down trade union offices and beat political opponents with wooden clubs. The sound of breaking glass and screaming filled Italian cities. At first glance, a rising power, but in reality, a political failure. In the 1919 elections, Mussolini's party failed to win a single seat. He was a laughingstock in parliament. But he didn't stop. He waited for the state to crumble further. Over the next 2 years, the middle class grew terrified of a communist revolution. Business owners and military generals looked for a protector. Events accelerated. By 1921, he officially formed the National Fascist Party. He was no longer a fringe radical. He was the leader of a massive organization backed by the wealthy and the powerful. They didn't love Mussolini, but they feared the chaos more. He positioned himself as the only man who could bring order. There was no turning back. Thus began the march toward total power. October 28, 1922. This was the day the march began. Italy was in total collapse. Factories stood still. Labor strikes paralyzed the cities. In the streets, socialist protesters clashed with nationalist gangs. The sound of glass shattering and gunfire became the new normal. Benito Mussolini saw his opening. He didn't just wait for an election. He organized 40,000 paramilitary followers known as the Blackshirts. They moved toward Rome. They occupied post offices and telegraph stations. They demanded total power. Why didn't the government fight back? It had the tools. King Victor Emmanuel III controlled the Italian army. The generals waited for the order to open fire. But the king hesitated. He paced the halls of the Quirinal Palace. He feared a bloody civil war that might cost him his crown. He believed he could tame Mussolini by bringing him into the government. At first glance, a strategic compromise, but in reality, a total surrender. On October 29, 1922, the king signed the document. Mussolini was now prime minister. He didn't waste a second. He began dismantling the foundations of the state. He changed election laws. He banned rival political parties. By 1925, the transformation was complete. Democracy was dead. Mussolini took the title Il Duce, the leader. The footage from this era shows a calculated performance. Mussolini stands on balconies with his chin thrust forward. He shouts at massive crowds. Behind the scenes, the Blackshirts operated as a state-sponsored hit squad. They beat opponents with clubs. They forced critics to drink castor oil. They committed political assassinations in broad daylight. This wasn't just governance, it was a police state. Mussolini focused on optics. He ordered the construction of massive highways and the draining of the Pontine marshes. He wanted the world to see a modern, disciplined Italy. The camera records, laborers digging, tractors moving, and new cities rising from the mud. But the numbers told a different story. The economy was hollow. These projects were expensive propaganda pieces. Debt rose while the average Italian struggled to buy bread. But this was only the beginning. In the 1930s, Mussolini looked toward Africa. He wanted an empire to rival ancient Rome. In 1935, he ordered the invasion of Ethiopia. The Italian military didn't just use rifles. They dropped mustard gas from airplanes. They burned villages. They used chemical weapons against soldiers carrying spears. The League of Nations issued verbal condemnations, but no one moved to stop the tanks. Mussolini watched the world's inaction. He felt invincible. By 1936, the geopolitical map shifted. Mussolini found a partner in Adolf Hitler. They were two sides of the same coin. Both hated democracy. Both loved military parades. In 1939, they solidified the relationship. They signed the Pact of Steel. It was a formal military alliance. Italy was now chained to the German war machine. Events accelerated. September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. World War II began. Mussolini waited on the sidelines for 9 months. He watched the German Wehrmacht crush France. He didn't want to miss the spoils of victory. On June 10, 1940, Mussolini stood on his balcony. He declared war on Great Britain and France. He told his generals the war would be over in weeks. He was wrong. Italy was not ready for a global conflict. The military lacked coal, steel, and modern tanks. The results were immediate and humiliating. In the mountains of Greece, the Italian army stalled and retreated. In the deserts of North Africa, thousands of Italian soldiers were captured. On the Eastern Front in Russia, the Italian corps was annihilated in the snow. The dream of a new Roman Empire vanished. By 1943, the tide had turned. Allied bombers appeared over Italian cities. The sound of air raid sirens replaced the cheering crowds. Food was scarce. The people were tired of the empty promises. At first glance, Mussolini's grip on power remained absolute, but in reality, the foundation was crumbling. The story reached a breaking point. July 9, 1943. Allied forces launched a massive amphibious assault on the shores of Sicily. It was the beginning of the end for the Axis in the Mediterranean. The Italian army was broken. Soldiers abandoned their posts. Food was scarce, and the streets of Rome were filled with hungry, exhausted citizens. Morale did not just drop, it vanished. Was there any way to save the regime? The king didn't think so. King Victor Emmanuel III met in secret with high-ranking generals and officials. They reached a single conclusion. Mussolini was no longer an asset. He was a liability that had to be liquidated. July 24, 1943. The Fascist Grand Council gathered behind closed doors. The meeting lasted into the early hours of the morning. For the first time in 20 years, Mussolini's subordinates defied him. They held a formal vote on his leadership. The result was a crushing defeat for the Duce. The next day, the king summoned Mussolini to the royal palace. The meeting was short. The king spoke plainly. Mussolini was out. Marshal Pietro Badoglio was the new leader of Italy. The footage from that day shows a stunned Mussolini walking out of the palace. He expected a car. Instead, he found an ambulance waiting for him. Carabinieri officers stepped forward and forced him inside. He was under arrest. The government was terrified of a pro-fascist uprising. To prevent a rescue, they moved the prisoner constantly. First to naval bases, then to remote islands. Finally, they took him to the Gran Sasso Mountains. His cell was the Hotel Campo Imperatore. It sat 6,000 feet above sea level. It was accessible only by a single cable car. At first glance, it was an impenetrable fortress. But in reality, it was a trap. September 8, 1943. The new Italian government made its move. They signed a formal armistice with the Allies. Italy surrendered. Across the country, Italian soldiers threw down their weapons or turned them against German units. The alliance was dead. But Adolf Hitler was watching. He refused to accept the loss of his partner. September 12, 1943. The sound of glider engines filled the mountain air. German paratroopers descended on Gran Sasso in a mission called Operation Oak. The guards at the hotel were stunned. They offered no resistance. Within minutes, the Germans reached Mussolini's room. Not a single shot was fired. Hitler flew Mussolini to East Prussia. He gave him a new title and a new territory. Mussolini became the head of the Italian Social Republic in the north. It was a puppet state controlled entirely by Berlin. The camera records a different Mussolini in the final months. He looks thin, his eyes are hollow. He no longer shouts from balconies. He had a title, but he had zero power. He was a ghost waiting for the end. The end was coming fast. April 25, 1945. The fascist experiment was over. In northern Italy, the front lines were dissolving. Allied tanks pushed from the south, while Italian partisans seized control of the mountain passes. Benito Mussolini sat in Milan, surrounded by empty offices and silent telephones. The city was a trap. 1 year earlier, thousands would have cheered his name. Now, the streets belonged to the resistance. He attempted to negotiate a surrender at the palace of Archbishop Alfredo Schuster. The meeting lasted only minutes. Mussolini discovered the Germans were already negotiating behind his back. He stood up and walked out. There would be no deal. Action followed immediately. Mussolini gathered a small cache of documents and gold. He climbed into his car and fled north toward Lake Como. He wasn't alone. His mistress, Clara Petacci, joined the convoy. She refused to stay behind. Several high-ranking officials and a small unit of German SS soldiers provided the escort. But where could he go? Switzerland was the target. He hoped a neutral border would offer safety from the gallows, but the roads were blocked. Partisan units had established checkpoints every few miles. They were looking for him. The footage from those days shows a broken man. Mussolini realized he could not pass as a head of state. He took off his uniform and put on a gray Luftwaffe overcoat. He pulled a German helmet low over his eyes. He sat in the back of a truck, pretending to be a drunken German corporal. The sound of the convoy's engines echoed off the lake. 30 vehicles moved slowly toward the border. They reached the town of Dongo. Partisans stepped into the road with machine guns. The convoy stopped. Why didn't the SS fight? They had the weapons, but they had no more orders. The German commander struck a deal. The Germans could pass, but every Italian in the convoy had to be searched. At first glance, he was just another retreating soldier, but in reality, he was the most wanted man in Italy. The search began. A partisan named Giuseppe Negri climbed into the truck. He looked at the soldiers huddled under blankets. One man sat in the corner, slumped against the wood. Negri pulled the helmet back. He recognized the jawline and the eyes. "We have him," Negri shouted. The disguise had failed. Mussolini was pulled from the vehicle. The German convoy drove away, leaving him behind. The dictator was now a prisoner of the people he once ruled. Events accelerated. There was no turning back. April 27, 1945. The convoy reached Dongo on the western shore of Lake Como. This was a narrow passage between the mountains and the water. The 57th Garibaldi Brigade controlled the sector. These were communist resistance fighters. They were not looking for soldiers. They were hunting for fleeing fascists. Pierluigi Bellini della Stelle and Urbano Lazzaro led the unit. They didn't just wait. They positioned men on the cliffs, set up heavy roadblocks, and trained their sights on the road. When the convoy slowed down, the partisans surrounded the vehicles. They demanded a total German surrender. The German officers looked at the terrain and the rifles. They knew the war was lost. They handed over their Mausers and Lugers without firing a shot. The search began. Partisans moved from truck to truck, pulling back canvas covers. They found government ministers, high-ranking officials, and black-shirted officers hiding among the German infantry. The mood turned. The soldiers were allowed to pass, but the Italians were pulled into the dirt. Mussolini sat in the back of a German transport. He was silent. He wore a German corporal's overcoat and a steel helmet pulled low. He stayed still, hoping the shadows would hide his face. But Urbano Lazzaro climbed onto the truck bed. He saw a man huddled in the corner. He was short and stocky. His face was unnaturally pale. Lazzaro looked closer. He recognized the jawline. The footage from the time shows the reality. The man didn't look like a dictator. He looked exhausted. His hands were empty. Lazzaro ordered him to stand. Mussolini obeyed. He didn't say a word. The partisans stripped off the German coat and took the helmet. There was no mistake. It was the Duce. He offered no resistance. He did not shout. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply walked where he was told. They drove him to a small farmhouse in the village of Bonzanico. 2 guards stood at the door with submachine guns. Inside, the partisan leaders argued. Some wanted to hand him to the Allied forces for a formal trial. Others wanted him dead before sunrise. To the men in that room, he wasn't a head of state anymore. He was a prisoner. Under the cold light of a farmhouse lamp, the era of Italian fascism ended. Mussolini waited in silence. Events accelerated. There was no turning back. April 28, 1945. 6 in the morning. The air in northern Italy was cold and the sky remained overcast. The war in Europe was in its final days. In a small village near Lake Como, the end of Benito Mussolini was approaching. Orders arrived from the National Liberation Committee in Milan. The command was clear: execution. Walter Audizio, a partisan leader using the code name Colonel Valerio, took charge of the mission. He gathered his men and checked his weapons. Why was Audizio chosen? He was a hardened veteran. The committee needed someone who would not hesitate at the final moment. 2 in the afternoon. Audizio and a group of armed partisans reached the farmhouse where the prisoners were held. They did not talk. They moved Mussolini and his mistress, Claretta Petacci, toward a red Alfa Romeo parked outside. The engine started. The car drove to Giulino di Mazzegra. It was a quiet village only a few miles away. The tires crunched on the gravel as the vehicle stopped near a stone wall. The partisans opened the doors and ordered the pair to step out. Petacci gripped Mussolini's arm. She refused to let go. The footage of the aftermath shows the setting, a narrow road and a cold stone barrier. The partisans forced them into position against the wall. Mussolini stood still. Petacci remained at his side. At exactly 4:10 in the afternoon, the silence broke. Walter Audizio raised a French MAS-38 submachine gun. He pulled the trigger. The first bullets hit Mussolini in the chest. Petacci screamed and lunged toward him. She did not reach him. The partisans fired again, hitting her multiple times before she hit the ground. But the execution continued. The group did not stop firing when the targets fell. They unloaded their magazines into Mussolini's body as it lay on the dirt. The sound of metal hitting stone and flesh filled the air. At first glance, a standard execution, but in reality, it was a slaughter. Medical reports later confirmed the violence. Mussolini was hit more than 12 times. Some sources claim over 40 bullets tore through the corpse. The wall was covered in chips of stone and blood. The soldiers looked at the bodies. There was no movement. The job was finished. Thus ended the reign of the Duce. April 29, 1945. 3 in the morning. A heavy truck pulled into Milan. Inside the cargo bed lay the bodies of Benito Mussolini, Clara Petacci, and 15 executed fascist officials. The partisans did not cover the corpses. They did not hide the blood. They had spent the previous hours driving through towns, parading the dead like trophies. Why did they choose this specific route? Justice was not enough. The partisans wanted a public spectacle. They drove toward Piazzale Loreto, a major square in the heart of the city. The location was a calculated choice. It was a site of blood. On August 10, 1944, Mussolini's Blackshirts had executed 15 resistance fighters in this exact square. The fascists left the bodies on the pavement for the entire day. They wanted the sun and the flies to serve as a warning. Now, 9 months later, the roles were reversed. But the scale of the violence was about to increase. The truck stopped in the center of the square. Men lowered the tailgate and dumped the bodies onto the concrete like bags of refuse. The crowd was already waiting. Thousands of people surged forward. They did not just watch, they acted. Footage from the scene shows the chaos. People kicked Mussolini in the head. They spat on his face. Others took out pistols and emptied their magazines into the lifeless meat. The sound of gunshots mixed with the roar of the mob. Clara Petacci received the same treatment. She held no official office, yet the crowd saw her as a part of the dictator. They beat her. They tore at her clothes. They treated her corpse with the same calculated cruelty as the men beside her. But Mussolini remained the primary target. His face soon became a pulp of bone and bruised flesh. It got worse. The partisans realized the crowd in the back could not see the results. They needed a higher vantage point. They dragged the bodies to a Standard Oil gas station on the edge of the square. There was a metal girder near the roof. The soldiers found thick ropes and meat hooks. They tied the ropes around the ankles of the dead. One by one, they hauled the bodies upward. Mussolini, Petacci, and 5 others now hung upside down from the beam. Their blood dripped onto the pavement below. The crowd cheered at the sight of the dangling figures. In London, the reaction was different. Even Winston Churchill, a man who had spent years trying to destroy the Italian regime, expressed disgust. He stated that execution was a matter of war, but this public mutilation was something else entirely. The spectacle lasted for hours. Thus ended the reign of the Il Duce, April 29, 1945. This was justice. This was revenge for 20 years of dictatorship, military failure, and starvation. The crowd in Milan had finished their work. 3 hours passed. The authorities finally ordered the bodies to be taken down from the meat hooks at the gas station. They placed the remains into cheap wooden coffins. The wood was rough and unpainted. 2 trucks transported them to a local morgue for identification. Where do you hide a dictator? The government had no answer. They feared a public burial. They feared his supporters would turn a grave into a shrine for the movement. Officials chose an unmarked plot in Musacco Cemetery outside Milan. There was no headstone. There was no ceremony. But the story did not end in the dirt. On Easter Sunday, 1946, the grave was disturbed. A group of hardcore fascists dug up the remains. They loaded the body into a car and began a secret journey across Italy. They wanted a monument. They wanted a martyr. The police launched a massive manhunt. For weeks, the body moved between villas and monasteries. Eventually, the authorities tracked it down. But they didn't bury him again. For 11 years, the Italian government kept the body hidden in a secret location to prevent further theft. 1957. The political climate shifted. The government gave in to persistent requests from the Mussolini family. They allowed the remains to return to his hometown of Predappio. This time, the burial was official. The tomb remains there today. The camera shows a stone crypt and heavy bronze doors. It still attracts visitors. Some are die-hard supporters who leave flowers. Others are tourists who stand in silence. The era ended, but the grave remains a focal point.